Cavalier County, Dakota Territory. January 13th, 1884. The thermometer outside the general store in Langdon read 42 degrees below zero. 42 below. Cold enough to freeze a man's spit before it hit the ground. Cold enough to kill exposed flesh in 60 seconds. Cold enough to turn the northern prairie into a white death that stretched from the Canadian border to the horizon and beyond. Inside every cabin, scattered across that frozen landscape, families huddled around fireplaces that roared and crackled and consumed wood at a terrifying rate. Flames leaped 3 feet high. Men woke every 90 minutes to feed more logs into hungry mouths of stone and iron. Children slept in piles of wool blankets on raised platforms because the floor, just 10 feet from those roaring fires, was covered in frost. The heat went up. It always went up. It rose to the ceiling where nobody lived, leaked through the roof into the killing sky, and left the floor frozen solid no matter how much wood a man burned, in every cabin except one. 8 miles south of the Canadian border, in a small structure built of hewn logs and fitted stone, 2 children played barefoot on the floor. They wore thin night clothes. They laughed as they stacked wooden blocks into towers and knocked them down again. Their mother sat nearby, her belly round with a third child due in spring, mending a torn shirt by lamplight. Their father fed the fire pit below the floor, a fire that burned in a stone chamber 3 feet underground, sending its smoke through 40 feet of channels beneath the cabin before it ever reached the chimney on the far wall. The floor was warm, 72 degrees at the surface. The children's bare feet pressed against smooth stone that radiated gentle heat upward into the room. Outside, the temperature could kill a man in 3 minutes. Inside, a family lived in comfort. The neighbors had called this man crazy. They had laughed at his construction. They had gathered at the general store to place bets on when his family would suffocate from smoke or freeze when his ridiculous system failed. They called him the Pole who built his fireplace upside down. His name was Kazimierz Wojcik. And this is the story of how one immigrant, mocked by everyone around him, built the only thing that could save them all. 3 years earlier, spring of 1881, the ship had carried them across the Atlantic in conditions that Kazimierz would never forget. Hundreds of bodies pressed together in steerage, the stench of sickness and fear, the endless rolling of waves that turned strong men into groaning wrecks. Jadwiga had clutched their 3-year-old daughter Aniela through every storm, whispering prayers in Polish while the wooden hull creaked and shuddered around them. Their son Tomasz had been born in 1880, the year before they left Poland. He was not yet walking when they boarded the ship, a baby who cried through the Atlantic crossing and finally learned to stand on American soil. He was 1 year old when they arrived, too young to remember the homeland he would never see again. They had left the Podlasia region in northeastern Poland, fleeing the heavy hand of Russian imperial rule. For generations, the partition had divided their homeland between empires that cared nothing for Polish language, Polish culture, Polish dreams. Kazimierz had watched his neighbors disappear into Siberian exile for crimes as small as teaching children to read in their mother.
You want to burn fire beneath our children? If the smoke leaks, we will all die in our beds.
Tongue. America promised something different. America promised land, freedom, a future where a man could build something that belonged to him alone. But Kazimierz carried something else across that ocean, something that could not be taxed or confiscated or burned by imperial soldiers. He carried knowledge. The knowledge had come from tragedy. In the winter of 1861, when Kazimierz was 12 years old, his father Stanisław had built a new cabin for their growing family. He built it the way everyone built cabins, with a stone fireplace against the wall and a chimney rising straight up through the roof. He built it the way practical men built things, copying what others had done before. The winter of 1861 was brutal. Snow piled 5 feet deep against the walls. The fireplace roared day and night, consuming wood faster than Stanisław could supply it. And still the floor froze. Still the children shivered in their beds. Still the cold crept up from below, no matter how hot the flames burned. Then the roof collapsed. The weight of accumulated snow, combined with the constant freeze-thaw cycle around the chimney, had weakened the structure. It came down in the middle of the night. Stanisław threw himself over his son, shielding the boy with his own body as timber and snow crashed around them. Casimir survived. His father did not. The last words Stanislav spoke, pinned beneath a beam with blood running from his mouth, would echo in his son's memory for the rest of his life. The old ones in the village. They knew how to build right. I should have listened. I should have learned. After the funeral, Kazimierz went to live with his grandfather in a neighboring village. The old man's house was 200 years old, built by ancestors who remembered different ways. The first thing Kazimierz noticed was the floor. It was warm, not hot, not cold, warm, even in the depths of winter when snow buried the village and ice hung from every eave. The floor radiated gentle, constant heat that rose up into the room and kept everything comfortable. How, Kazimierz had asked, how was the floor warm when there is no fire here? His grandfather had smiled, taken the boy's hand, and led him outside to a small structure attached to the house. Inside was a fire pit, burning slowly, its smoke disappearing into stone channels that ran beneath the main building. Heat rises, the old man explained. This is physics. This is truth. When you put fire beside you, the heat rises to the ceiling where nobody lives. When you put fire below you, the heat rises through the floor, through the room, through everything a family touches. The same fire, the same fuel, different results. Casimir spent his teenage years learning the mason's trade in Białystok, building the massive tile stoves that wealthy families used to heat their manor houses. But he never forgot his grandfather's lesson. He never forgot the warm floor of that ancient house. He never forgot the last words his father spoke. The old ones knew how to build right. When Kazimierz and Jadwiga and their two small children arrived in New York Harbor in the spring of 1881, they carried 2 trunks of belongings and a lifetime of knowledge stored in Kazimierz's memory. They traveled by train across a continent that seemed to have no end, watching forests give way to farmland, give way to prairie that stretched to the horizon in every direction. They settled in Dakota territory because land was cheap and Polish communities had begun to form in the northern reaches. Kazimierz found work as a farmhand on an established homestead, learning the rhythms of American agriculture while saving every penny toward a claim of his own. His first winter nearly killed him. The cabin where he worked had a conventional American fireplace, stone and mortar rising against the wall with a chimney that drew the smoke straight up. The farmer burned wood constantly, feeding flames that roared and crackled and sent their heat directly to the ceiling. The family slept on raised platforms to escape the frozen floor. They woke every few hours to feed the fire. They huddled near the hearth in heavy coats while frost formed on their own floorboards 10 feet away. Kazimierz watched this with quiet disbelief.
Building a fireplace in a hole?
Smoke rises, friend. You're building a tomb, not a cabin.
The fire worked hard. The chimney drew well. The problem was not the flame. The problem was where the heat went afterward, straight up, through the roof, into the Dakota sky. The floor where people actually lived and walked and worked received almost nothing. By 1883, Kazimierz had saved enough to claim 160 acres under the Homestead Act. The land was 8 miles south of the Canadian border in Cavalier County, flat and treeless and exposed to every wind that howled down from Manitoba. His nearest neighbor, a Norwegian farmer named Torsten Lindgren, had built a conventional cabin with a conventional fireplace. So had every other settler for miles around. They all fought the same battle every winter. They all lost. Kazimierz would build something different. The children had grown in those 2 years of farmhand work. Aniela was now 5 years old, a bright girl who helped her mother with chores and asked questions about everything. Tomasz was 3, running and climbing and exploring every corner of their small world. And Scout had joined the family. The dog had come from a Polish family returning to the old country, unable to take their animals on the long journey back. Scout was 2 years old when Kazimierz took him in, a brown and white hunting dog with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. He had protected Aniela and Tomasz through their time in the farmhand quarters, sleeping at the foot of their beds, alert to every sound. Now he would watch over them as Kazimierz built something that would change everything. The argument with Jadwiga began the moment he showed her the plans. They stood on their new property in early May, the spring thaw still softening the ground, while Kazimierz walked her through his vision. He pointed at stakes marking not just the cabin footprint, but a complex pattern of trenches beneath it. The fire goes here, he said, indicating a spot in the corner, 3 feet below the floor. Stone chamber, properly vented. The smoke travels through channels under the entire cabin before it reaches the chimney on the far wall. Jadwiga stared at him. Her face, weathered by the Atlantic crossing and 2 years of Dakota hardship, showed something between confusion and fear. You want to burn fire beneath our children, she said. Beneath Aniela, beneath Tomasz. In a stone chamber, Kazimierz explained. Properly sealed. The smoke never enters the room. It travels under the floor and exits through the chimney. And if the stones crack? Jadwiga's voice rose. If the smoke leaks through the floor while we sleep, the children will suffocate. We will all die in our beds. I have already lost your father to winter. I cannot lose our children. The stones will not crack. I will build it the way my grandfather built, the way his grandfather built. Thick channels sealed with clay and covered with heavy slabs. But Jadwiga was not finished. She turned away, her voice hardening with a resolve that Kazimierz had rarely heard. If you continue with this madness, I will take the children to Langdon. We will stay with the priest until you come to your senses. I will not watch my babies die because you trust the words of a dead grandfather more than the eyes of your living wife. Kazimierz felt her words like a blow. Jadwiga had followed him across an ocean. She had buried her dreams of a comfortable life for the uncertainty of the frontier. She had nursed 2 children through seasickness and strange lands and winters that tried to kill them. And now she stood before him, threatening to leave, and he could not blame her. The Americans have fireplaces, she continued. Stone fireplaces against the wall. They work. They work badly. Kazimierz spoke with quiet intensity, the memory of his father's death burning in every word. They heat the ceiling while the floor freezes. I watched children sleep in their coats all winter because the floor was too cold to touch. Our children will play barefoot on warm stones. I swear this to you. Jadwiga studied him for a long moment. The man she had married was stubborn, but he had never lied to her. He had never made a promise he could not keep. In all their years together, through poverty and displacement, in the terror of starting over in a new world, he had always done exactly what he said he would do. Give me until autumn, Kazimierz said quietly. If the system does not work as I promise, I will tear it down myself and build a fireplace like everyone else. But give me the chance to prove what I know. Until autumn, Jadwiga replied, not one day longer. The news of Kazimierz Wojciech's plan reached the general store in Langdon within a week. Torsten Lindgren had mentioned it to another farmer. That farmer had told someone else. By the time 2 weeks had passed, every homesteader in Cavalier County had heard about the Polish immigrant building his fireplace underground. The reactions ranged from amusement to alarm. At Cromwell's general store, where farmers gathered to buy supplies and exchange news, the discussion grew heated on a warm afternoon in late May. Thaddeus Cromwell himself, a thick-bodied man with a full beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing, stood behind the counter listening to his customers debate. He is building the fire in a hole, one farmer said. 3 feet underground, smoke running beneath the floor for 40 feet before it reaches the chimney. Man is either crazy or trying to kill his family. Heard he has got no proper chimney at all until the far wall. 40 feet of smoke channel under the cabin first. That is not a fireplace. That is a way to die by.
I'll give you $200 to tear it down and build a normal fireplace. Stop this foolishness.
In your sleep. Thaddeus Cromwell listened to these conversations with quiet calculation. He sold firewood to half the homesteaders in the county. He sold the stone and mortar for their conventional fireplaces. He sold the replacement parts when chimneys cracked and hearths crumbled. If this Wojciech fellow had found a way to heat a cabin with less wood, if other farmers started copying his method, Cromwell's profits would suffer. He made a mental note to visit the Polish claim and see this underground fireplace for himself. Torsten Lindgren arrived at the Wojciech property on a June morning and found Kazimierz 3 feet deep in an excavation pit. The Norwegian was 45 years old, with 6 winters of Dakota experience etched into the lines of his face. He had survived blizzards that killed his neighbors. He had buried livestock frozen solid in fields just yards from shelter. He knew what winter could do to unprepared men. Planning a root cellar, he called down to the figure in the pit. Kazimierz looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. His English had improved over 2 years, but still carried the heavy rhythm of Polish consonants. A fireplace, he said, under the floor, 3 feet down. The smoke travels beneath the cabin before it exits. The floor becomes warm. Lindgren stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not cruel, genuinely confused. Friend. Smoke rises. Fire goes in a fireplace against the wall. Chimney goes up. That is how it works. Yes. Kazimierz climbed out of the pit and stood facing the taller Norwegian. In Poland, we learn to make heat go where we need it. Lindgren shook his head slowly. I have been farming this territory 6 years. I have seen men try clever ideas. Root cellars that flooded, sod roofs that collapsed. New approaches do not survive Dakota winters. This approach survived centuries in Poland. Winters colder than this. Poland has got forests, Lindgren said, has got hills to block the wind. We have got grass and sky and cold that will freeze your blood between the barn and the house. He crouched at the edge of the pit, looking down at the stones Kazimierz had already begun laying for the underground fire chamber. What happens when those smoke channels fill with soot? When the seals fail and carbon monoxide seeps through your floor while you sleep? I will clean the channels each autumn. Kazimierz pointed at marks on his construction plan. Access hatches at every turn. The seals are clay over stone. They hold for decades. This is proven construction. Lindgren rose and mounted his horse. He looked down at the Polish immigrant with something between respect and concern. I hope you are right, Wojciech. I genuinely do. But I have seen this territory humble men with better ideas than underground smoke. The excavation continued through June and into July. Kazimierz worked alone, Jadwiga watching from the temporary shelter they had built, while caring for the children. Scout lay at the edge of the pit hour after hour, watching his master move stone and earth with quiet patience. The fire pit took shape first. 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep. Kazimierz lined the walls with the thickest stones he had collected from a creek bed 10 miles away. Each stone was mortared with clay that would harden in the fire's heat. A stone lintel across the top would support the access hatch, a removable slab that allowed him to feed the fire from inside the cabin without smoke entering the living space. The channel system required the most careful work. From the fire pit, Kazimierz dug a trench 8 inches deep and 12 inches wide. He ran it in a serpentine pattern across the entire cabin footprint. North from the fire pit, turn east, double back west, turn again. A continuous snake that covered 40 feet before finally reaching the chimney location on the far wall. He lined each section with flat stones laid on edge, creating smooth walls that would not trap soot or obstruct airflow. The floor of each channel received the flattest stones, carefully fitted to prevent ash accumulation. Fire clay sealed every joint, mixed thick and pressed into each gap. The channel covers came next. Large flat slabs, some weighing over 100 pounds, were laid across the trenches to create the base layer of the cabin floor. Kazimierz fitted them with precision, leaving no gaps where smoke could escape, yet ensuring they could be removed individually for cleaning. Then came the accident. On a July afternoon with the sun beating down and the excavation nearly complete, a section of earthen wall gave way. The collapse happened without warning. One moment Kazimierz stood in the trench examining his stonework. The next moment he was buried to the waist in soil and rock, his right leg twisted beneath him, pain shooting through his body like fire. Scout began barking frantically. The sound carried across the prairie to the temporary shelter, where Jadwiga was preparing the midday meal. She ran to the pit and found her husband half buried, struggling to free himself, his face pale with pain. Tomasz, stay with your sister, she commanded, then scrambled down into the excavation to dig at the soil with her bare hands. But she could not move him. The weight was too great, the angle too awkward. Help, she screamed. Someone help us. Torsten Lindgren heard the cries from nearly a mile away. He had been riding back from Langdon and changed direction immediately, pushing his horse to a gallop. When he arrived, he found Jadwiga still digging, her hand bloody from the rocks. Kazimierz barely conscious from pain. Together they cleared enough soil to pull the Polish immigrant free. His leg was not broken, but the shoulder he had landed on was badly damaged. He would not be able to work for weeks. The Pole's own earth tried to kill him, Lindgren reported at Cromwell's store that evening. The walls of his fire pit collapsed and buried him. His wife had to dig him out. Thaddeus Cromwell nodded slowly. Perhaps that is a sign. Perhaps the land itself is telling him to stop. Perhaps, Lindgren agreed. But I saw the look in his eyes when we pulled him free. He is not going to stop. He will finish that system if it kills him. Cromwell said nothing, but his mind was already working on other ways to ensure that the Polish fireplace would fail. By mid-August, the underground system was complete. 40 feet of stone channels beneath a cabin footprint of 16 by 20 feet, connecting a sunken fire pit to a chimney that would rise from the far wall. Kazimierz lit a small test fire and walked the floor above, pressing his palm against the stones at intervals. Within an hour, he felt warmth radiating through the slabs, faint but unmistakable. The system drew properly. The heat transferred as planned. Jadwiga watched him test the stones. The deadline she had given him was approaching. Autumn was only weeks away. If the system failed, she would make good on her threat. She would take the children to Langdon and wait for her husband to come to his senses. But the floor was warm. She knelt and pressed her own palm against the stone surface. Heat met her skin, gentle but unmistakable. "It works," she whispered. Kazimierz knelt beside her. "And this is with only a small fire. In winter, with a proper burn, the floor will be warmer than any cabin in Dakota territory." Jadwiga looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, accepting what she felt with her own hand. "I was wrong to doubt you," she said. "You were right to fear for the children." Kazimierz took her hand. "A mother should fear, but you do not need to fear anymore." The confrontation at Cromwell's general store came in early September. Kazimierz had ridden into Langdon for supplies. Lime, more fire clay, provisions for the autumn. He found a group of homesteaders gathered near the counter, their conversation falling silent as he entered. Thaddeus Cromwell stood behind the counter with his arms crossed. He was a large man, prosperous by frontier standards, with clean clothes and well-fed features that set him apart from the weathered farmers who were his customers. "Wojciech," Cromwell said, "the man building his fireplace in a hole?" Kazimierz collected his supplies without responding. He had learned that silence often served better than argument. "I visited your property last week," Cromwell continued. "Saw those channels you dug."
I called you crazy. My family was freezing 3 miles away while yours was walking barefoot. I was wrong.
"Impressive work. Lot of stone. Lot of labor." Kazimierz set his items on the counter and reached for his wallet. "Must have been expensive," Cromwell said. "All that stone, all that clay, and you will need twice as much when the system fails and you have to build a real fireplace." The other farmers chuckled. Kazimierz paid for his supplies. He loaded them onto his wagon. He did not speak a single word. Cromwell followed him outside. "I am not trying to make trouble," the storekeeper said. His voice carried a different tone now, lower, almost friendly. "But I have been thinking. Your system uses less wood. I have calculated it. Maybe half as much as a conventional fireplace." Kazimierz paused, one hand on his wagon. "I sell wood to most of the families in this county," Cromwell continued. "If your system works, if other people start building like you, I lose customers." He stepped closer. "I am prepared to offer you $200 to abandon this project. Build a normal fireplace. Tell everyone your experiment failed. $200 is more than your homestead is worth." Kazimierz climbed onto his wagon. He gathered the reins and looked down at Thaddeus Cromwell. "The system will not fail." He drove away without looking back. "But now I want to ask you something. You have heard how the neighbors laughed. You have seen what Kazimierz built against all opposition. You have watched him refuse $200 rather than abandon his grandfather's wisdom. Do you think he was right to trust the old ways? Or were the skeptics justified in their concerns? Tell me in the comments, and make sure you subscribe to this channel so you do not miss what happens next. Because the winter of 1884 is coming, and it will be the coldest winter in Dakota Territory history. By late October, the Wojciech cabin had become the most discussed structure in Cavalier County. Homesteaders made detours on their way to Langdon just to ride past and stare at the building with the chimney on the wrong wall. They gathered at Cromwell's store to debate whether the Polish family would suffocate, freeze, or somehow burned down a cabin with no proper fireplace visible inside. The reactions had shifted from amusement to genuine alarm. "It is not natural," one homesteader declared, warming his hands near the pot-bellied stove at Cromwell's. "A fireplace belongs against a wall where you can see it, where you can warm yourself by it. His family cannot even sit by their fire. It is buried in the ground." "The smoke has got to be leaking somewhere," another agreed. "Run it under a floor for 40 feet and something will crack. They will be dead by Christmas." Thaddeus Cromwell listened to these conversations with quiet satisfaction. He had not forgotten Kazimier's refusal of his offer. $200 rejected without a moment's hesitation. The Pole had made a fool of him in front of his customers. Cromwell had begun spreading his own version of events. He told farmers that the underground system was dangerous. He suggested that responsible men should warn Mrs. Wojcik about the risks to her children. He hinted that perhaps the county sheriff should inspect the property for safety violations. The whisper campaign took root. Ingrid Dahl, a farmer's wife known for carrying news between homesteads faster than the postal service, visited Jadwiga in late October. She brought a basket of preserved vegetables as a neighborly gesture. "Your cabin has no fireplace," Ingrid said, her eyes scanning the interior. "No hearth. Where do you gather in the evening? How do you cook?" Jadwiga gestured at the iron stove they use for summer cooking and at the access hatch in the floor near the corner. "The fire is there, beneath us. In winter, I cook over the fire pit. There is a grate above the flames beneath." Ingrid touched the floor with her boot, feeling the slight warmth that lingered from the morning fire. "It is unusual, unnatural, some would say. In Poland, the old homes all heated this way. The floor is warm. The children can play anywhere in the room, not just near a hearth." Ingrid left with promises of friendship and returned to town with tales of the strange Polish cabin where fire burned underground and children played on heated stone like it was the most normal thing in the world. Father Declan O'Malley came calling the following week. The Irish priest served a scattered congregation across 3 counties, traveling by horseback to reach families too distant for regular church attendance. He was 55 years old, white-haired and weathered, with a gentle manner that had comforted many families through Dakota's hardships. "Kazimierz," the priest said, standing in the cabin doorway. "May I come in?" "Of course, Father." O'Malley entered slowly, his eyes taking in the unusual arrangement. The chimney on the wrong wall, the access hatch in the floor, the absence of any conventional hearth. "The parishioners are talking," the priest said carefully. "They are worried about your family." "Worried about what?" "About this." Father O'Malley gestured at the floor. "About fire burning beneath where your children sleep. About smoke traveling through channels underground. Some are saying it is dangerous. Others are saying it is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Unnatural." Kazimierz knelt and lifted the edge of the access hatch, revealing the stone fire pit below. Cold now, the ashes gray from the morning burn. "Do you understand how heat moves, Father? I am not an engineer. Heat rises. This is simple physics. God made it so. When fire burns beside you, the heat rises to the ceiling. Wasted. When fire burns below you, the heat rises through the floor, through the room, through everything a family needs to keep warm." Father O'Malley listened. He was not a man who dismissed ideas simply because they were unfamiliar. "And the smoke?" he asked. "It never enters the room?" "Never. It travels through sealed channels and exits through the chimney. My grandfather's house was built this way 200 years ago. The stones still hold. The seals never failed." The priest nodded slowly. He touched the floor with his palm, feeling the residual warmth from hours earlier. "I do not understand the science, but I will pray for your family's safety, and I will tell those who are worried that I saw nothing here to cause alarm. Thank you, Father." O'Malley paused at the door. "I have learned in my years serving this frontier that God's wisdom sometimes comes through unexpected channels. Perhaps your grandfather's knowledge is one of them, but there was one man in Cavalier County who had seen heated floors before. Willem Janssen was 70 years old, a Dutch immigrant who had arrived in Dakota Territory a decade earlier. He had lost his wife to fever, his sons to the lure of California gold, and lived alone on a small claim where he raised chickens and waited to die. When he heard about the Polish underground fireplace, he saddled his old mare and rode 8 miles to see for himself. Kazimierz found the elderly man standing at the edge of his property, staring at the chimney that rose from the wrong wall. "I know this," Janssen said in heavily accented English. "I have seen this before." "Where?" "In Holland, in Germany, in the old farmhouses where my grandmother lived. They called it different names in different places, but the principle was always the same. Fire below, heat rising through the floor." Kazimierz felt something release in his chest. For months he had been alone in his conviction, mocked by neighbors, doubted by friends. Even Jadwiga had needed convincing. Now finally someone else remembered. "They will laugh at you," Jansen said. "They always laugh at the old ways, until the old ways save them." He mounted his horse with the slow care of aging joints. "I have watched this territory for 10 years. I have seen winters that killed strong men and summers that broke the stubborn ones. You are building something that will last, Wojciech. Do not let them stop you." The first hard frost came on November 6th. Kazimierz lit a larger fire than usual in the underground pit, feeding it steadily for 6 hours before letting it die to coals. He and Jadwiga retired for the night as temperatures dropped to 18 degrees outside. The floor radiated gentle, even warmth throughout the night. At midnight, the thermometer inside the cabin read 58 degrees. At dawn, 8 hours after the last log burned, it read 52 degrees. The thermal mass of the heated stone had held its warmth while the Dakota wind howled outside. Jadwiga woke to find her children sitting on the warm floor, playing in their nightclothes. She had never seen them do that in winter. Torsten Lindgren visited in mid-November, curious despite his skepticism. He found the Wojciech family comfortable in their cabin, the children barefoot, Kazimierz working at a small table, Jadwiga preparing a meal. The Norwegian pressed his palm against the floor and held it there for a long moment. "It is warm," he admitted, "genuinely warm. 54 degrees at the surface this morning." Kazimierz set down his tools. "The air is cooler, but the heat rises from below. We are comfortable." Lindgren walked the cabin slowly, testing the floor at intervals. The warmth was consistent everywhere. Near the fire pit, in the far corners, along the walls, no cold spots, no frozen patches. "How much wood did you burn last night?" "About 60 pounds, a 4-hour fire in the evening." "Nothing overnight." Lindgren was silent. His own fireplace consumed twice that amount just to keep the frost off his floorboards. And his family still slept on raised platforms, wrapped in heavy blankets, waking every 90 minutes to feed more logs into the roaring flames. "I will admit," he said finally, "that I did not expect this to work. But it is only November. The real cold has not come yet." "I know," Kazimierz replied. "When the real cold comes, you will see." December brought the first real test. A cold snap descended on December 15th, dropping temperatures to 22 below zero for 3 consecutive days. The wind howled down from Manitoba, driving snow horizontally across the prairie. Visibility dropped to nothing. Livestock that could not reach shelter froze where they stood. At the Lindgren farm, Torsten burned through his carefully stacked woodpile at an alarming rate. His fireplace roared constantly, flames leaping 3 feet high. And still his family shivered. Still his children slept in piles of blankets. Still the frost crept across his floor at night. At the Wojciech cabin, Kazimierz maintained his routine: a 4-hour fire in the morning, a 3-hour fire in the evening. The stone floor absorbed the heat and released it slowly through the night. The children played barefoot on the warm surface, while the temperature outside dropped to levels that could kill in minutes. Jadwiga watched her family in comfort while the wind screamed past the walls. She thought of the argument they had had in May, of her fear that the children would suffocate, of her threat to take them to Langdon. She had been wrong, and she was grateful beyond words. The cold snap broke on
I wanted you to fail because your system uses less wood. It threatened my business. And yet, you saved my daughter.
December 18th. Temperatures climbed back to merely brutal. The Lindgren family emerged from their cabin exhausted, their woodpile half depleted. Other homesteaders reported similar struggles. One man had burned through a month's supply of fuel in 3 days. At Cromwell's store, the conversation had shifted. "Did you hear about the Wojciech cabin?" someone asked. "What about it?" "They made it through the cold snap, burning half the wood we did, less than half. And his children never put on shoes the whole time." Silence fell over the group. Thaddeus Cromwell, standing behind his counter, said nothing, but his jaw tightened and the lines around his eyes deepened. The system was working. If other farmers started building like Wojciech, Cromwell's business would never recover. On January 10, 1884, old Willem Jansen looked at the sky and felt the barometric pressure drop against his aging bones. He had lived 70 years. He had survived wars and famines and diseases that killed stronger men. He had learned to read weather in ways that younger people dismissed as superstition. Something was coming, something worse than anything Dakota Territory had seen. He rode to the Wojciech cabin that afternoon, his old mare struggling through the snow that had accumulated over the previous week. "Wojciech," he called from the saddle, "bad weather coming, worse than December. Maybe worse than anyone here has seen." Kazimierz came outside, Scout padding at his heels. "How bad?" Janssen shook his head. "I do not know. But the birds flew south 3 weeks early. My chickens have been restless for days. The pressure in my joints tells me something is wrong." He pointed at the sky, where high clouds were gathering in unusual formations. "Get extra wood inside, make sure your animals are sheltered, and pray that your floor holds enough heat, because when this storm hits, you will not be able to step outside for anything." Casimir spent the next day preparing. He moved additional firewood inside the cabin, stacking it against one wall. He checked every seal in the channel system, reinforcing any spot that looked vulnerable. He secured the livestock in their small shelter and filled it with extra bedding. Jadwiga watched him work with growing concern. "Is it truly that serious? Maybe, maybe not. But if the old man is right, I want to be ready." That night, the family ate dinner on their warm floor, while the last sunset of normalcy painted the western sky in shades of red and gold. Scout lay near the children, his head resting on Tamash's small leg. Aniela practiced her letters on a slate, the chalk scratching softly in the quiet room. It was the last peaceful evening they would know for weeks. Before I continue with what happened next, I want you to think about what is coming. The winter of 1884 will be the coldest in Dakota Territory history, 42 degrees below zero. Wind chills that defy survival. Days when stepping outside means death. What do you think will happen to the families who laughed at Kazimierz? What do you think they will do when their conventional fireplaces fail? Tell me your predictions in the comments. And stay with me for the next part of this story. The storm arrived on January 11th. It began like other storms, snow falling steadily in the morning, wind increasing through the afternoon, visibility dropping as darkness approached. But this storm did not stop. By midnight, the temperature had dropped from a mild 15 degrees to 22 below zero. By dawn on January 12th, the mercury had plunged to 35 below. The wind screamed across the prairie at 30 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally with enough force to strip skin from exposed flesh. And still the temperature fell. On the morning of January 13th, the thermometer outside Torsten Lindgren's farmhouse read 42 degrees below zero, the coldest temperature recorded in Cavalier County since settlement began. At that temperature, exposed skin could freeze in less than 60 seconds. Spit would freeze before it hit the ground. Metal became brittle enough to shatter under impact. The air itself seemed to crystallize, each breath burning the lungs like fire. The snow did not fall, it attacked. Horizontal sheets of white that reduced visibility to nothing. A man could become lost 20 feet from his own door, disoriented by the screaming wind and the complete absence of any landmark. Across Cavalier County, the desperate battle for survival began. At the Lindgren farm, Torsten burned through his remaining woodpile at a terrifying rate. His fireplace roared day and night, flames leaping 3 feet high, consuming wood faster than he could split it. And still frost formed on his floor 10 feet from the hearth. Still his children huddled in piles of blankets, their breath visible in the cold air, their feet too frozen to touch the ground. He woke every 90 minutes to feed the flames. He stumbled through darkness that seemed to press in from every direction. His wife cried silently, clutching their youngest child, watching their oldest son's fingers turn white with cold despite the heavy mittens. At the Cromwell property in town, the massive stone fireplace cracked on the second night. The temperature differential between the roaring fire inside and the killing cold outside had split the mortar between the stones. Smoke began seeping into the room. Thaddeus Cromwell stuffed rags into the gaps and burned twice the wood for half the heat. His wife and 3 children huddled in one corner, wrapped in every blanket they owned. A bachelor homesteader named William Garrett ran out of firewood on January 14th. He burned his furniture, then his floorboards. He cut away the very boards he stood on to feed the flames that kept him alive. When neighbors found him 2 days later, he was alive but delirious, crouching in a corner of a cabin with no floor, surrounded by frozen earth. 2 men died in the first week of the storm. Thomas Burke, a homesteader 3 miles north of Langdon, went out to his barn on January 12th to check on his livestock. He was found in the spring thaw 20 feet from his door. He had become disoriented in the whiteout and walked in circles until the cold took him. Eric Olsen, a Norwegian farmer with a wife and 4 children, collapsed from exhaustion on January 15th. He had been awake for 3 days straight, feeding his fireplace constantly, trying to keep his family alive. His heart gave out while carrying wood from the pile outside. His wife found him in the snow, frozen solid, his arms still wrapped around the logs he had been carrying. At the Wojcik cabin, January 11th began like any other winter day. Kazimierz woke before dawn, lifted the access hatch in the floor, and descended into the fire pit to light the morning blaze. He fed it steadily for 4 hours, while his family slept above on the warm floor. Dry oak and ash, burning hot and clean. The smoke traveled its 40-foot journey beneath the cabin, surrendering its heat to the stone before escaping through the chimney on the far wall. By the time temperatures plunged to 42 below, the stone floor had absorbed enough heat to radiate warmth for the next 12 hours. Kazimierz and Jadwiga spent the worst of the cold snap inside their cabin, venturing out only to tend the livestock in their small shelter 30 feet away. Each trip was a battle. Kazimierz wrapped every inch of exposed skin, moved quickly, and returned to the warmth as fast as possible. Inside, the children played. Aniela and Tomasz sat on the floor in their stocking feet, building towers with wooden blocks. They napped on blankets spread directly on the heated surface. They never once shivered. They never once complained of cold. The thermometer by the door read 55 degrees on the coldest morning. The floor surface measured 72 degrees, warmer than the air above it, radiating gentle heat upward into the living space while the killing winds screamed past the walls. Jadwiga sat near the window, trying to see through the frost that coated the glass. She could make out nothing but white. White sky, white ground, white death in every direction. Inside, her children laughed as another tower toppled. On the 5th day of the storm, Tomasz became sick. He woke with a fever that Jadwiga could feel burning through his skin. His small body trembled. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. He cried weakly, without strength, without the energy that a 3-year-old should have. Kazimierz, Jadwiga's voice cracked. Tomasz is burning. Kazimierz crossed the room and knelt beside his son. The boy's forehead was hot to the touch. Dangerously hot. In normal times, they would have ridden for a doctor in Langdon. They would have sought medicine, advice, help of any kind. But stepping outside now meant death. The storm still raged. The temperature still hovered near 40 below. A man on horseback would freeze before reaching the end of his own property. They were alone. Kazimierz built up the fire in the pit, maintaining the floor temperature at the highest safe level. Jadwiga wrapped Tomasz in light blankets and laid him directly on the warm stone. She bathed his forehead with cool water and prayed in Polish, the words of her childhood streaming from her lips like a river of desperate hope. Scout lay beside the sick boy, his body pressed against Tomasz's small form. The dog had not moved from the child's side since the fever began. He seemed to understand that something was wrong. All through that night, Jadwiga held her son on the warm floor, while the storm tried to kill everything outside. She thought of the children who had died in this territory, the countless small graves that dotted the prairie, markers of families who had lost against cold and distance and isolation. She thought of the conventional fireplaces in other cabins, their heat rising uselessly to ceilings while floors froze solid. Sick children in those homes lay on ice-cold surfaces, their bodies fighting fever, while cold crept up from below to steal whatever warmth remained. Her son lay on warm stone, the floor that everyone had mocked, the system that Cromwell had called dangerous, the underground fire that neighbors said would kill them all. It was keeping her boy alive. By morning, Tamash's fever had broken. He woke weak but clear-eyed, asking for water and then for food. Jadwiga cried with relief, clutching her son against her chest while Kazimierz stoked the fire below. The storm continued for 4 more days. 9 days total, the longest and most brutal weather event in Dakota Territory's recorded history. When the wind finally died and the snow finally stopped and the temperature finally climbed back to merely dangerous, the Wojcik family emerged from their cabin into a transformed world. Snow had drifted to the roof lines of some buildings. The landscape was unrecognizable, all familiar landmarks buried beneath white. The silence after days of screaming wind was almost painful. Kazimierz looked toward the Lindgren farm, 3 miles distant. He could see no smoke rising from the chimney. He saddled his horse and rode out to check on his neighbor. Torsten Lindgren's cabin was still standing, but just barely. The roof had developed a dangerous sag under the weight of accumulated snow. Frost covered every interior surface except for a small semicircle around the dying fireplace. The woodpile was completely exhausted. Lindgren himself sat slumped against the wall, his wife and 3 children huddled around him, all of them wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned. They had been without fire for 6 hours. The temperature inside had dropped to dangerous levels. The children's lips were blue. Wojciech, Lindgren's voice was barely a whisper. You came. Can you walk? Your family, can they walk? Yes, I think so, but we have no wood, no fire. We have been burning furniture since yesterday. Kazimierz helped the family to their feet. The eldest son, a boy of 12, could barely stand. The youngest, a girl of 5, had to be carried. They stumbled out into the bright snow and loaded onto a makeshift sled that Kazimierz had brought. The 3-mile journey to the Wojcik cabin took 2 hours. The snow was too deep for normal travel. The cold, though less severe than during the storm, still bit at exposed skin. When they finally reached the cabin, Kazimierz opened the door and ushered the Lindgren family inside. Torsten Lindgren stopped 3 steps through the doorway. He had been to this cabin before. He had felt the warm floor in November and again in December. But that had been curiosity, investigation, the examination of an unusual technique by a skeptical neighbor. This was different. His family was freezing. His children had been hours from death. He had watched his wife cry silently as the cold crept closer and the fire died. He had felt the despair of a man who could not protect the people he loved most. And now he stood in a room where the air was warm, without a visible flame, where the floor radiated heat like a living thing, where 2 small children played barefoot in the corner, healthy and comfortable, while his own children could barely walk. The floor, he breathed. The whole floor is warm, 72 degrees at the surface. Kazimierz guided Lindgren's youngest to a spot near the center of the room. Sit down, rest, let the heat come up through you. The Lindgren family sank onto the warm stone. For a long moment, nobody spoke. They simply absorbed the warmth, felt it rising through their frozen bodies, let it thaw the fear that had gripped them for days. Lindgren's wife began to cry, quiet tears that ran down her weathered cheeks and dropped onto the floor that had saved them. How? Lindgren asked. How is this possible? Kazimierz explained. The fire pit, the channels, the 40 feet of heat transfer, the thermal mass of the stone. He used simple words, direct words, the same explanation he had given dozens of times to skeptics who never believed. But Lindgren was not skeptical anymore. Lindgren was sitting on proof. I called you crazy, the Norwegian said. When you first dug that pit, I told everyone you were building a death trap. You did not understand. I still do not understand. Not completely, but I understand enough. Lindgren looked around the room, at his children warming on the floor, at Scout lying contentedly near the fire pit hatch, at Jadwiga serving warm broth to his exhausted wife. This is what saved you. While we were dying 3 miles away, your family was comfortable. Yes. Lindgren was quiet for a long moment. I was wrong, he said finally. We were all wrong. The next visitor arrived on January 18th. Kazimierz heard the sound first. A weak pounding at the door, barely audible. He opened it to find a figure collapsed against the frame, covered in frost, barely conscious. It was Thaddeus Cromwell, the storekeeper who had offered money to sabotage the project, the man who had spread rumors about danger and death, the businessman who had hoped to profit from Kazimier's failure. Now he knelt in the snow, 2 fingers blackened by frostbite, his face raw with cold, his voice a desperate rasp. Wojciech, my daughter, Emma, 7 years old. She is at the store. She is dying. Our fireplace cracked. We have no heat. Please. Kazimierz looked at this man who had been his enemy, this man who had tried to destroy him for profit, this man who had laughed loudest when others mocked the underground fire. He thought of his father dying beneath a collapsed roof. He thought of his grandfather sharing knowledge freely with anyone who asked. He thought of the words he had spoken months ago. Cold does not choose its victims by nationality, neither should warmth. He looked back at Jadwiga. She met his eyes, her hand resting on her swollen belly where their 3rd child grew. She nodded once. Bring them here, Casimir said. All of them, now. Cromwell's family arrived an hour later. His wife carried Emma, wrapped in so many blankets that only her face was visible. The girl was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin an alarming shade of gray. They laid her on the warm floor near the fire pit. Jadwiga covered her with light blankets and began the slow process of warming a body that had come too close to death. For 6 hours, Emma did not speak. She lay on the warm stone, breathing slowly, her body struggling to return from wherever the cold had taken her. The Wojciech cabin now held 14 people. The Wojciech family of 4 plus the unborn child, the Lindgren family of 5, the Cromwell family of 4, and Scout, who moved between the groups, offering comfort with his presence. They sat on the floor. They shared what food there was. They listened to the wind outside and felt the warmth below, and gradually, slowly began to believe that they might survive. Emma Cromwell woke near midnight. Her first words, spoken in a voice rough from disuse, were directed at Scout, who had settled beside her without being asked. "Can I pet the dog?" Her father, sitting nearby with his bandaged hands held carefully in his lap, broke down sobbing. Great racking cries that shook his entire body. His wife held him, while his daughters watched with wide eyes. Kazimierz pretended not to notice. He fed the fire below and checked the floor temperature and made small talk with Lindgren about spring planting. Some things did not require witnesses. Before we continue to the end of this story, I want to pause and ask you something important. Kazimierz had every reason to turn Thaddeus Cromwell away. The man had tried to destroy him, had spread lies about his family, had hoped to profit from his failure. But Kazimierz saved him anyway, saved his daughter, saved his wife, and then pretended not to notice when the man who had been his enemy broke down in tears. Could you have done the same? If someone had worked against you, laughed at you, tried to ruin you, and then came begging for help, could you have opened your door? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. The storm finally released its grip on January 20th. The survivors emerged from the Wojciech cabin into a transformed world. Snow drifted 8 feet high against buildings. Familiar landmarks had vanished beneath white. The silence was absolute, all sound absorbed by the endless snow. They began to assess the damage. 2 men dead, frozen within sight of shelter. Livestock losses that would take years to recover. 3 cabins with collapsed roofs. 7 families who had burned furniture and floorboards to survive. The Wojciech family had lost nothing. Their cabin was intact. Their livestock had survived in its small but adequate shelter. Their children were healthy, their stores adequate, and everyone who had mocked them now owed them their lives. Torsten Lindgren gathered the survivors outside the Wojciech cabin on January 21st. He had something to say, and he wanted witnesses. 2 months ago, he began, I told Kazimierz Wojciech that his system would never work. I told him that Dakota winters were different from Polish winters. I told him that clever ideas die in this territory. He paused, looking at the cabin behind him, at the chimney on the wrong wall, at the access hatch visible through the open door, at the warm floor that had saved 14 lives. I was wrong, Lindgren's voice cracked. I was a fool. This man built the only thing that could save us, and I laughed at him for it. He turned to face Kazimierz directly. I owe you my life. I owe you my children's lives. I owe you everything, and I do not know how to repay it. Kazimierz shook his head. You owe me nothing. Build this system on your own land. Teach others how to build it. That is payment enough. Thaddeus Cromwell had remained silent through Lindgren's speech. The storekeeper stood apart from the group, his bandaged hands held against his chest, his eyes fixed on the ground. Now he stepped forward. I owe you more than an apology. Everyone turned to look at him, the man who had offered bribes, the man who had spread rumors, the man whose daughter had nearly died in his own store. I knew your system would work, Cromwell said. I saw it work in November. I saw it work in December. I knew you had found something better. He raised his head, meeting Kazimier's eyes. But I sell wood. I sell materials for conventional fireplaces. Your system uses less wood. It threatens my business. So I told people it was dangerous. I tried to make you fail. I wanted you to fail. The crowd was silent. I did this for money, Cromwell continued. While you were building something that could save lives, I was trying to destroy you for profit. And when my own daughter was dying, when my own fireplace failed, you still saved her. You saved all of us. He lowered himself to his knees in the snow, a proud man, humbled completely. I do not deserve forgiveness, he said, but I am asking for it anyway, and I am asking you to teach me. Teach me to build what you built, so I can never be this weak, this selfish, this wrong again. Kazimierz looked at the man kneeling before him. He thought of revenge. He thought of justice. He thought of all the cold nights he had spent digging while this man laughed. Then he reached down and helped Thaddeus Cromwell to his feet. I knew you were working against me, from the beginning. Cromwell blinked. You knew? Of course. A man does not offer $200 for an experiment to fail unless that failure benefits him somehow. Kazimierz released Cromwell's arm. It does not matter now. What matters is that you understand. What matters is that you learn. The storekeeper nodded slowly. I understand, and I will learn. Father Declan O'Malley arrived 3 days later, having made a difficult journey from his parish 20 miles south. He had heard about the storm, about the deaths, about the Polish cabin where 14 people had survived when all logic said they should have perished. He found Kazimierz outside, splitting wood while Scout lay in a sunny spot nearby. I prayed for your family, the priest said. All through the storm I prayed. I know, Father, thank you. But I am beginning to think that God answered those prayers before I made them. O'Malley looked at the cabin, at the chimney on the wrong wall, at the access hatch visible through the open door. He answered them through your grandfather, through the knowledge he passed to you, through your hands that built what others could not imagine. Kazimierz set down his axe. Perhaps, or perhaps God simply made heat rise, and my grandfather was wise enough to notice. The priest smiled. Perhaps both things are true. Spring came slowly to Cavalier County in 1884. The snow took weeks to melt. Bodies were found as the drifts receded, grim reminders of what the winter had taken. Livestock carcasses dotted the prairie. Collapsed cabins revealed the weakness of conventional construction. But amid the loss, something new was growing. Torsten Lindgren was the first to commit to building his own radiant floor system. He arrived at the Wojcik cabin in early April with his 2 eldest sons, notebooks ready, prepared to learn everything Kazimierz could teach. The excavation comes first, Kazimierz explained. 3 feet deep for the fire pit, 8 inches deep for the channels. The pattern must cover the entire floor. No shortcuts, no dead spots. He spent 4 days teaching stone selection, channel construction, and proper clay mixing ratios. He showed them how to lay flat stones for smooth smoke flow, how to seal joints without blocking passages, and how to build access hatches for annual cleaning. You are giving away everything, Lindgren said on the 4th day. You could charge for this knowledge. People would pay. Kazimierz shook his head. In Poland, every village knew how to build heated floors. Here, I am the only one. If I keep the secret dies with me. If I share it, it lives forever. He taught anyone who asked. Peter Haugen, a young homesteader who had visited the previous autumn, came back with his notes and built his own system before his wife gave birth in February. The baby arrived in a cabin with a warm floor, the first child in Dakota Territory to be born on heated stone. Willem Janssen brought 3 young farmers from a Dutch community 20 miles south. They stayed for a week learning the techniques their own ancestors had forgotten. Even Thaddeus Cromwell came to learn. His fingers had healed, though two remained permanently numb. He worked alongside men who had been his customers, learning to dig channels and lay stone and seal joints with clay. I will still sell wood, he told Kazimierz. People will still need fuel. But I will also sell the stone and clay for heated floors. And I will tell everyone who asks that your system works, that it saved my family. By summer of 1884, 6 new radiant floor systems were under construction across Cavalier County. By autumn, the number had reached 15. The Langdon newspaper ran a story in September about what they called the Polish method of underfloor heating. Letters arrived from across Dakota Territory, from Minnesota and Montana, from settlers desperate for any alternative to fireplaces that heated ceilings while floors froze. Kazimierz answered every letter. He drew diagrams, explained principles, described the construction sequence in careful detail. He charged nothing. He refused payment even when it was pressed upon him. The knowledge spread like warmth from a heated floor, slowly, steadily, reaching every corner it could touch. Jadwiga gave birth on March 15, 1884. The baby came easily, or as easily as any birth comes. Jadwiga labored on a blanket spread over the warm floor, supported by a midwife from Langdon, who marveled at the comfort of the room. "It is like summer in here," the midwife said. "In March, on the prairie. How is this possible?" "My husband built it," Jadwiga answered between contractions. "The neighbors said he was crazy. The neighbors were wrong. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, with strong lungs that announced his arrival to the entire cabin." Kazimierz held him with trembling hands, remembering the boy who had survived the fever on this very floor. Tomasz, who was now 4 years old and running to meet his new brother. "What will you name him?" the midwife asked. Kazimierz looked at Jadwiga. She nodded. "Stanisław," Kazimierz said. "After my father, the grandfather who had died because he built the wrong way, whose death had sent a 12-year-old boy to live with his own grandfather, whose last words had planted the seed of knowledge that had saved 14 lives. Stanisław Wojciech, born on a warm floor, born into a family that had learned from tragedy, born to carry forward what the old ones knew. The years passed as years do on the prairie. Seasons of planting and harvest, of blizzards survived and summers endured. The Wojciech children grew tall on that warm floor. Anela learned to read and write and calculate, skills that would eventually take her to a teaching position in Langdon. Tomasz developed his father's gift for construction, building his first heated floor at age 16. Stanisław, the baby born in 1884, became a farmer like his father, inheriting the original claim and expanding it over decades. By 1895, radiant floor heating had spread beyond Cavalier County into neighboring Pembina, Walsh, and Towner counties. Agricultural journals published articles about the Polish method. Farmers who had once laughed at underground fire now taught their own sons the techniques. Scout passed away in the autumn of 1895, at the age of 14. The old dog had been failing for months, his eyes growing dim, his steps growing slow. He spent his last days on the warm floor where he had spent so many winters, surrounded by the family he had protected for more than a decade. Kazimierz buried him on a small hill overlooking the cabin. He carved a simple marker and placed it at the head of the grave. Scout, a good dude. A faithful friend it was, he would later tell his grandchildren, one of the saddest days of his life, but also one of the most fitting. Scout had lived well and died warm, which was more than many creatures could say about their time in Dakota Territory. In 1901, Kazimierz received an invitation that surprised him. The North Dakota Agricultural Extension wanted him to speak at their annual meeting in Bismarck. 300 farmers would be in attendance, men from across the state, eager to learn from the immigrant who had revolutionized winter survival on the northern prairie. Kazimierz was 52 years old. His hair had gone gray. His hands bore the scars of decades of stonework. His English, though much improved, still carried the heavy rhythm of Polish consonants. But he went, and he spoke. Heat rises, he told the assembled crowd. This is physics. No man can change it. The question is where you let it rise from. From a fireplace against the wall, the heat rises to the ceiling. Useless. From a fire beneath the floor, the heat rises through the room, warming everything it meets. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Some young, some old, some skeptical, some eager. Same fire, same fuel, different results. He told them about his father's death, about his grandfather's warm floor, about the neighbors who had laughed and the winter that had humbled them all. He drew diagrams on a large board and answered questions for 2 hours after his formal remarks ended. When he finished, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. 300 men, standing and clapping for a Polish immigrant who had arrived with nothing but knowledge and refused to let that knowledge die. Kazimierz Wojciech died on a spring morning in 1924. He was 75 years old. He passed peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren, on the same warm floor where his family had survived the winter of 1884. The system he had built 41 years earlier still functioned perfectly. The stones still held heat, the seals still kept smoke out of the room, the chimney still drew on the far wall. Jadwiga sat beside him as he went, holding the hand that had built their home, their life, their legacy. In my grandfather's house, Kazimierz whispered near the end, the floor was always warm. I wanted our children to know that feeling. They know it, Jadwiga told him. They have always known it. Because of you. He smiled, and then he was gone. Jadwiga outlived him by 6 years. She spent her final winters walking on the warm stone floor they had built together, remembering a young husband who had dug in the cold earth while neighbors laughed, who had trusted knowledge passed down through generations, who had saved everyone who once mocked him. After she passed, her daughter found a note tucked into the family Bible. Written in Jadwiga's careful Polish script, it read, "He said the fire belonged beneath our feet. I said he was building a tomb. He built us the warmest home in Dakota Territory. Our children never knew what it meant to have frozen floors. He understood something the Americans never learned. Heat wants to rise. Let it rise through the places where life happens." The original Wojciech cabin stood until 1952. By then, modern heating had arrived on the prairie. Oil furnaces and electric baseboards had replaced the wood fires of earlier generations. Stanisław's son, Kazimierz's grandson, made the decision to tear down the old structure and build something new. But before the demolition began, he lifted the floor stones one by one, exposing the system his grandfather had built. The channels were still intact. 70 years of use, 70 Dakota winters, and not a single crack in the stone or failure in the seals. The fire pit still showed ash from the last burn. The access hatches still opened smoothly. A professor from Montana State University came to document the system before it was destroyed. He measured the channel dimensions, analyzed the stone composition, studied the clay seals that had held for 7 decades. This design, the professor wrote in his report, demonstrates engineering principles that modern radiant heating has only recently rediscovered. The thermal mass calculations are remarkably precise. The channel layout maximizes heat transfer while minimizing resistance. Whoever built this system understood heat flow at an intuitive level that rivals contemporary analysis. The cabin came down, a modern house rose in its place, but the knowledge lived on. Today, radiant floor heating is found in homes across the world. Hydronic systems pump heated water through tubes beneath floors. Electric systems warm cables embedded in concrete. The mathematics have been refined, the materials modernized, the thermostats made digital. But the core insight remains unchanged. The same insight that a 12-year-old boy learned in his grandfather's house in Poland. The same insight that saved 14 lives in the winter of 1884. The same insight that one immigrant refused to keep secret even when sharing it benefited those who had tried to destroy him. Heat rises. Put fire beside you and the heat rises to the ceiling where nobody lives. Put fire below you and the heat rises through the floor, through the room, through everything a family touches. Same fire, same fuel, different results. The neighbors of Kazimierz Wojciech saw heat rising as a problem to fight against. They burned more wood, fed bigger fires, struggled constantly to replace what was lost. Kazimierz saw heat rising as a delivery mechanism, a natural force to work with rather than against, a way to carry warmth from below into every corner of a room. The lesson extends far beyond heating systems. Every problem has brute force solutions that exhaust those who attempt them. And every problem has elegant solutions that work with natural forces rather than against them. The people who laughed at Kazimierz were not stupid. They were not cruel. They were simply doing what they had always done, fighting the same battle their parents had fought, never stopping to ask if there might be a better way. The people who learned from him discovered that sometimes the old ways are not old at all. They are simply waiting to be remembered. In a small cemetery in Cavalier County, North Dakota, a weathered headstone marks the grave of Kazimierz Wojcik. The inscription is simple: born Poland, 1849, died Dakota, 1924. He built warmth where others built cold. Beside him lies Jadwiga, his wife of 43 years, and nearby a smaller marker for Scout, the dog who watched over them all. The warm floor is gone now, replaced by modern construction. But the knowledge Kazimierz shared spread across the prairie and beyond, surviving in the systems his students built, in the letters he wrote to strangers, in the story that passed from generation to generation. Heat rises. This is physics. This is truth. The question is not whether heat will rise. The question is where you let it rise from. Kazimierz Wojcik answered that question with stone and clay and 40 feet of carefully laid channels. He answered it by trusting what his grandfather knew. He answered it by forgiving those who wronged him and teaching those who asked. And because he answered it, because he built and shared and refused to let knowledge die with him, warmth spread across the Dakota prairie. Not just the warmth of heated stone, the warmth of community rebuilt, the warmth of neighbors who had learned to trust each other, the warmth of wisdom passed forward so that others might survive. That is the story of the warm floor. The story of a man who built his fireplace underground while everyone called him crazy. The story of a winter that nearly killed them all. The story of forgiveness and teaching and the old ways that never really die. Thank you for listening to the end. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the knowledge your own grandparents carried, if it reminded you that sometimes the old ways are the best ways, then I have one final request. Subscribe to this channel, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments what wisdom your family passed down that the world has forgotten. We all have warm floors to build. We all have knowledge to share. And we all have the choice between keeping secrets that die with us and giving gifts that live forever. Kazimierz Wojcik made his choice. What will yours be?
If this story moved you, if it made you think about the knowledge your own grandparents carried, if it reminded you that sometimes the old ways are the best ways, then I have one final request. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments what wisdom your family passed down that the world has forgotten. We all have warm floors to build. We all have knowledge to share. And we all have the choice between keeping secrets that die with us and giving gifts that live forever. Kazimierz Wojcik made his choice. What will yours be?